Right now, somewhere on this planet, a funeral is happening. Flowers are being laid down. Someone is being lowered into the ground in a box, facing a direction someone else decided mattered. You've probably been to one of these, and you probably didn't question why any of it happens the way it does. Digging a hole and putting a body inside it does nothing for the person who died. It costs the living time, effort, and resources they didn't have to spend. And yet, every human culture on Earth, in every era we have records for, does some version of this. Which raises a question that sounds simple until you actually try to answer it. Why would a species with barely enough resources to keep itself alive start spending those resources on people who were already gone? For most of human history, survival left no room for waste. Every hour spent digging a grave was an hour not spent hunting, gathering, or resting. Every ochre pigment ground down for a burial was pigment not used for anything practical, so the earliest deliberate burials aren't a footnote in our story. They're one of the strangest and most telling things our species ever did, and figuring out when it started and why means digging through some of the oldest evidence we have of humans thinking about something other than the next meal. Start with the oldest burial anyone has found. At a site called Qafzeh Cave, in what is now northern Israel, archaeologists uncovered the remains of a child, roughly 100,000 years old, positioned deliberately in a shallow pit, with a set of deer antlers placed carefully against the chest. Deliberate positioning, deliberate objects, red ochre pigment scattered nearby, a mineral that shows up again and again at ancient burial sites across the world for reasons researchers are still debating. This wasn't a body left where it fell. Someone chose the position, someone chose the antlers, someone made decisions about a corpse that served no survival purpose whatsoever. Now here's where it gets complicated, because for decades the story of burial belonged entirely to us, to Homo sapiens. Then researchers started looking closer at a cave in northern Iraq called Shanidar, where a set of Neanderthal remains had been excavated decades earlier. In the 1960s, archaeologist Ralph Solecki noticed clusters of pollen around one particular skeleton and proposed something that made headlines around the world. Neanderthals, he argued, had buried this individual with flowers. The idea of a grieving Neanderthal laying wildflowers over a body reshaped how an entire species was perceived almost overnight. Here's the twist nobody expects. That flower burial theory has spent the last several decades under serious attack. Later researchers pointed out that burrowing rodents common to the region are known to drag seed-bearing plants into their tunnels, and Shanidar Cave has plenty of rodent burrows running straight through the layer in question. The pollen might not be a funeral bouquet at all. It might be rodent nesting material that happened to end up in the wrong layer of sediment, which tells you something important about this entire field. Even when the evidence looks emotionally satisfying, researchers have to fight the urge to read grief into dirt. But even with the flowers in question, the burial itself at Shanidar isn't. Multiple Neanderthal individuals at that site were placed in deliberate, similar body positions, curled, or laid out consistently, in a pattern that repeats across more than one skeleton. Whatever the full story is, something intentional was happening there roughly 60,000 years ago, long before anyone assumes Neanderthals were capable of it. Move forward to a site called Sungir in what is now Russia, and the picture gets almost impossible to explain through simple grief alone. Around 34,000 years ago, someone buried two children, laid head to head, covered in an almost unbelievable quantity of ivory beads, an estimated 10,000 of them, each one carved and drilled by hand. Researchers calculate that producing that many beads using period-appropriate tools would have taken thousands of hours of skilled labor. Thousands of hours dedicated to objects that would immediately be buried underground and never seen again. This wasn't a quick practical disposal of a body. This was one of the largest material investments a hunter-gatherer group could possibly make, poured entirely into the ground. And it isn't only burial either. On the shores of a dry lake bed called Lake Mungo in Australia, researchers found the remains of a woman, cremated and buried around 42,000 years ago alongside red ochre scattered deliberately across the site. Not far away, another set of remains. A man was found stained thoroughly in red ochre pigment applied directly to the body before burial. That's two different treatments of the dead, cremation and pigment application, both requiring planning, both requiring effort, both happening on opposite sides of the planet from Qafzeh and Sungir, at roughly the same distant point in the past. So you've got deliberate positioning in Israel 100,000 years ago, possible intentional burial in Iraq 60,000 years ago, an almost incomprehensible investment of labor in Russia 34,000 years ago, cremation and pigment, ritual in Australia 42,000 years ago. Different continents, different tools, different climates, and somehow the same underlying behavior keeps showing up. Something about death made ancient humans stop and do something about it, again and again, independently, across the entire inhabited world. Here's where the real question gets harder because it's tempting to assume this is simply grief, and grief is certainly part of it. But archaeologist Paul Pettit, who has spent much of his career studying what he calls the archaeology of death, argues that burial behavior likely served several overlapping purposes at once, and grief alone doesn't explain the pattern. One likely factor is deeply practical. A decomposing body attracts scavengers, spreads disease, and creates an unpleasant, even dangerous presence inside a living space, especially for groups who return to the same cave or shelter repeatedly. Burying a body or removing it deliberately solved a real immediate problem. But that alone doesn't explain the antlers at Qafzeh or the 10,000 beads at Sungir. Practical disposal doesn't require ochre or careful positioning or thousands of hours of bead production. Something else was happening on top of the practical need, and that something looks a lot like symbolic thought, the same capacity that lets a person imagine a future that hasn't happened yet or a past that no longer exists. To bury someone with objects, you have to hold a belief, even an unspoken one, that something about that person continues to matter after their body stops functioning. That's not a small cognitive leap. It requires imagining a state of being that has never been observed, only inferred. There's another layer researchers keep circling back to, which is memory and identity. A burial site becomes a fixed point in the landscape, a place a group can return to, point at, and say, "This is where our dead are." Some researchers argue that formal burial may have doubled as an early way of marking territory and continuity, a physical claim that said, "This ground belongs to us, because generations of us are buried in it." If that's true, then burial wasn't only about honoring the dead. It was also about the living, about a group's sense of itself stretching backward through time and forward into a future that hadn't happened yet. And that reframes the entire question. The dead can't be helped by a grave, but the living clearly can. A shared burial ritual gives a group something to do together in the face of loss, a structured way to process an event that otherwise has no clear ending. It reinforces bonds between people who just watched someone they depended on disappear. It creates a story that gets repeated about who this person was and why they mattered, which is one of the earliest forms of the exact thing you do today when you tell someone about a person who's gone. So here's the full picture. 100,000 years ago, someone in a cave in Israel placed antlers on a child's chest with intention. 60,000 years ago, in a cave in Iraq, another species entirely may have been doing something similar, whether or not the flowers were real. 42,000 years ago, on a dry lake bed in Australia, two people were treated with fire and pigment in ways that took real planning. 34,000 years ago, in what's now Russia, a group poured thousands of hours of labor into beads that were never meant to be seen again. None of it kept anyone alive. All of it cost real time, real resources, real effort a hunter-gatherer group could not easily spare. Which means the impulse to mark death with meaning isn't a modern invention layered on top of practical survival. It's one of the oldest threads running through the entire human story. Older than agriculture, older than cities, quite possibly older than our own species. The next time you stand at a funeral watching flowers get placed on a box that does nothing for the person inside it, you're not performing some new social custom. You're doing something a small group of people were already doing in a cave in Israel 100,000 years ago, for reasons that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with what it means to notice that someone was here and now isn't, and that the difference is worth marking.